Hello, everyone. Alexander from GraphCMS speaking. I will be the moderator of today's webinar with Jesse Martin, developer advocate at GraphCMS, Jamstack, and GraphQL Expert. The webinar topic, Headless Content Management, Pitfalls, and Opportunities. Thank you all for joining us here today. Before we start with Jesse, I will just share some housekeeping rules, or better say, framework of the day. We'll be having the webinar for about 45 minutes and then have a few minutes for questions. If you have a very urgent question during the presentation and live screen sharing of Jesse, feel free to use the Q&A or the chat feature, which is at the bottom of your screen. I will take care to stop Jesse for a second and get your question answered. And after the webinar, we'll randomly select 3 of the participants who will win tickets for the GraphQL Conference Day taking place in the beginning of September, co-organized by GraphCMS, Honeypot, and a few other amazing organizations, which will take place in southern Germany, in Konstanz at Bodensee. More about this after the webinar today. And finally, the webinar is being recorded, but don't leave us now because the exciting part is going to start in just a second, when we'll have Jesse present all the knowledge and skills and best practices that life and work have given him. So Jesse, I'm leaving the floor to you. Tell us about headless content management, its pitfalls and opportunities.
All right, thanks for the intro, Alex. I'm not sure I'll have a whole lot of life skills to impart with the Headless CMS, but hopefully some of the experiences that we've had talking to amazing customers like you will help you cover some of the hurdles that you might encounter. Before I begin, I actually want to just mention that this is actually our first webinar with GraphCMS. So please send us any feedback that you would have. We would love to be able to incorporate that and make sure that these are as enriching and as helpful as possible for our community. So as Alex said, this is Headless Content Management, Pitfalls and Opportunities. And we're going to just look at some of the patterns we've seen emerge. We're going to look at some of the ways to think about headless integration, and we're going to go ahead and get started. First up, we're going to have a quick survey question, and that is, how many of you are actually using Headless CMS in production? And I believe you will see a poll actually pop up where you'll be able to quickly answer that question. We'll give that here just about 30 seconds to a minute for you guys to fill that in. All right, poll's disappeared, so it looks like it's all been responded. Very good. We'll be moving on and look at that answer afterwards. So a little bit about me. My name is Jesse Martin. I am the developer advocate at GraphCMS. I'm a husband and a father, which means that I do tend to tell dad jokes. I'm trying to keep that on the calm side today for the webinar, but warnings are ahead. I'm also an American, which means that I tend to speak English a little bit quickly. So if I am speaking too fast or too soft or too loud, just give us some feedback in the chat, and I will try to incorporate that accordingly. I'm also working on being a nice guy, but you know how that goes. All right, so what are we going to cover today? We're going to cover the headless stack. We're going to cover what moving to multi-channel really looks like with the headless. We're going to talk about how you can deconstruct your data and what that potentially could uncover for possibilities for your company. And then we're going to be looking at the opportunities to explore innovation and perhaps new avenues of business for your company through the process of adopting a headless CMS. The first order of business then is the headless stack, and we refer to this as the separation of concerns. Essentially, you want to have your content being owned by the content repo, and then you want to have all of your clients own the client code. And the example here with this photo You have all of your relationships defined. You have the model, the relationships all connected. And on the right-hand side, Alexa and the audio devices are able to request content specific to an Alexa or audio experience. And then you have the, I think it's a Google Home or Google Hub, that is able to request data that is relevant with visuals accompanying that. It's one of the benefits about Graph CMS is that we are a GraphQL native CMS, which means that these individual clients are able to request exactly the data they're looking for. So the Alexa is able to only get the content without the images, saving lots of data on the wire. And then the hub is able to request the images that it would like. This is not a specific talk about GraphQL, but it is something that makes us a little bit unique. So if you have any questions, definitely feel free to reach out, or even pop a couple of questions into the Q&A, and I'll be happy to answer those at the end. So the big idea here is that you have the content repo, and it is being assisted by microservices, perhaps, and then you have that being orchestrated by a server, and then that delivers essentially a magical experience to the user. All they see is what you've designed, what your UX team has envisioned, and in the back end, you have this coordination of various services. This is nothing more than the traditional model view controller paradigm that we've seen for years. In the case of Graph CMS, or the Headless CMS in specific, it is the model. This is where all your data lives. This is how we construct the content. And the microservices are essentially model helpers. These can be things like enriching your data set with real-time data. It could be adding real-time weather. It could be adding information about traffic if you have, let's say, a content repo of hotels. And then that's all orchestrated by your controller, which is then shipped down the wire to the actual view. Some examples would be, let's say, indexed content for something like Elasticsearch or Algolia. In this case, you would have your content repo, which hosts all of your data. And then the microservice is able to orchestrate that, is able to make a specific request for that content and pulls that data into Algolia. One of the things that you want to keep in mind with that is that it's best to have some kind of a state inside that microservice so that you have some kind of a memory about what data you've already fetched. You will want to have, let's say, either a running date, or you'll want to have the last index that, or the last ID that you indexed, so that you're able to be as minimal and as streamlined on fetching from Graph CMS and then pumping that into Algolia or Elastic, where you tend to pay for the size of the index that you're processing on ingress. And then you want to have, so that's the persistent state, and you'll want to be able to have exactly what I just said. Missed that point there. All right. If you are curious about kind of how that might look in practice, I do have a small repo here available. I will share these slides afterwards so you can grab the URL. But this is a simple node script that does take content from Graph CMS and pumps it into an Algolia index. It's nothing fancy. It's definitely not production ready, but it will get you started to kind of get a vision around how that would look. If we have enough developers here today that express interest in the Q&A, I'm happy to open up that code sample in the Q&A afterwards, and we can do a small walkthrough on those details. Another example, caching and analysis. So again, you have a microservice that will grab all the content out of Graph CMS, again, perhaps enrich it with another microservice, and then dump it into some sort of a key value store where you'd be able to run various algorithms on it and some business logic that may be long-lived or perhaps really expensive, and you want to run that on specialized hardware for that exact case. This is, again, this idea of orchestrating your content and your data with multiple services. So you fetch the content to be indexed, and then you persist the state for rolling updates again as well, because again, these can be expensive operations depending on the amount of content you are indexing. And the nice thing about it is then you can also bring your own analytics. It's a helpful approach to be able to then say what kind of repetitions in our content are we using, what kind of patterns do we see as far as reading, what kind of just patterns of any kind that you would want to observe from your content. And then another very common example would be with commerce. So in this case, we are big advocates of the idea of headless commerce, and the idea that you kind of need to get your mind around with headless commerce is that the traditional commerce tool, or the headless commerce tool, is doing nothing more than tracking SKUs. And it's going to say, okay, this SKU is going to be located in this warehouse, or this many of this SKU is located in this warehouse. And at the end of the day, your commerce tool really only thinks about your product in terms of SKUs. And as we as a consumer tend to see that as product variants. The commerce system really couldn't care less about how you handle it, how you order the product. It's simply just a massive database of all of the actual individual products. So when we go online to order a pair of tennis shoes and we want to order the red one or the black one or whatever color, those are actually individual SKUs, but you need some system to be able to group those together and identify them as variants of the same product. That's where something like a headless CMS comes in handy, because then you're able to actually connect the various SKUs into a single product. You can either attach them, you could use a microservice in this case to either write data back into the headless CMS to say, okay, we're associating these SKUs with this product entry in my content model, or you would be able to simply do that manually. And then when you query that content from GraphCMS, you'd be able to see, okay, here is the product and all of my variants that I have listed up. And then the other benefit about the microservice approach is that if you do have a headless commerce like Molten or Commerce Tools, Commerce Layer, Snipcart, there's a handful of other ones as well, you'll be able to potentially either stitch or even federate those APIs into a single API for your consumer, so that the developers actually can make one request for products and variants. Even though it's hitting two different endpoints, they're seeing a unified experience for querying that content and reducing their amount of round trips on the wire. And then you have obviously the search engine performances and just in general search engine APIs. You maybe want to take advantage of AMP. In this case, you have a special AMP template on the server that you're wanting to build out those templates with. So if you're not familiar with AMP, it's kind of like it's basically a HTML with optimized tags for Google to pre-cache the pages essentially for a much faster load time. It's getting a lot better. Google's putting a lot of weight behind it. It's something they recommend doing for a lot of SEO benefits. But in this case, you'd use the microservice to fetch that content, build those HTML pages statically, and then make them available on your server. Those oftentimes are an entirely different flow and a different kind of template and everything from the rest of your website. And this is a case where you would want to perhaps use the benefit of a microservice to do that. Or maybe you want to work with something like Google comparison shopping sites, and you want to sort of turn your content into a product API that's consumable by some sort of a comparison site. This is a service where a microservice can grab your content, do any kind of transforms on it in a way that's beneficial and helpful for the service, for the comparison site, and then deliver that via API, not having to do any additional content, exporting content from the headless and importing it to another tool. You can do this all exactly from a single endpoint. And then you have the benefit of actually exploring new concepts. You're able to actually enable new targets in parallel. There's no impact on your daily operation. You're able to test out new VR targets. You're able to test out those audio targets without disrupting your day-to-day operations and having your backend developers have to hack a solution into your existing CMS. It's one of the benefits of having the headless approach is that because that data is separate from your individual solution, from your website, you're able to branch off of that for any other approach you would want to take. I'm going to touch on that a little bit more later inside of the enterprise approach or the innovation approach at the end of the talk, and we'll come back to it. This is actually the first section here, so I'm going to just reach out to you real quick, Alex, and see if we've happened to pick up any questions so far.
We're good so far, so we can continue. I'm looking for the next one.
Very good.
Oh, thanks.
Very good. All right, so we'll keep moving on then. Okay, so then moving on to multi-channel, the idea then that your content can live in all places. This next slide here, I'm a little bit fond of because it's a really important topic for embracing the headless approach. And that is that with the headless CMS, you're able to hire technology experts, not CMS experts. You want to hire people that are really good with Java or Swift or latest JavaScript or Kotlin people, whatever it may be, and not people who just happen to be really good at implementing Drupal or Umbraco or Episerver. This becomes one of the difficult elements about saying, okay, we need to have this really specific technology. Do you have experience with it? It's getting difficult to find somebody who knows this older version of the system where you're working with this version or that version. And yeah, it can be a blocker for a lot of people. Whereas if you hire technology experts that are able to work quickly with modern tooling, they're able to actually get up and running very quickly with your content and be able to say, oh yeah, this is just a JavaScript website, or this is a Java backend. I can work with that. So I think we see some questions. Okay, it looks like there's questions about the repo. We'll come back to that at the end. So the idea here is that you want to embrace the platform mesh. And what I mean by that is that when you have content living in isolation away from your individual, not coupled with your front-end logic, you're able to work with these different teams that can actually produce content and produce the code for these final projects. So you maybe have a web team that has developers, that has its own agile process, it has its own marketing people. You have a voice team that are focused on the individual concerns of voice target. Alexa, is this more of a commerce thing? Is this more of an index thing? What kind of content are we targeting for voice? You have the mobile team or even just the data team itself that's able to actually scrub your content and be able to perform analytics on it. You don't have to try and give all these people access to the one code base and, trying to set up really specific restrictions and say, okay, well, yes, you can go into the CMS, but please don't touch anything. Or they're constantly asking for access to that other piece of content that they needed. With the content repo, you're able to handle all of the access from the content center, and then those individual teams can pull the data and be able to work with those in isolation. That allows mobile, perhaps they're faster or they have a smaller context. They're able to ship faster than the web team, or the voice team is able to ship completely on a different timeline as everybody else, as everybody figures out what's the best approach for voice targets. It allows freedom and speed in a way that a monolithic CMS can't offer, because you have to work all these moving parts in tandem. And it also then allows you to embrace modern tooling. So with the traditional CMS, most of them don't even actually support a basic CSS preprocessor. For the non-technical people in our audience today, this is the idea of being able to use variables or perhaps some kind of looping over a couple of keywords to produce a lot more style information for your page with much less code. Is considered a basic and best practice of modern development, to be able to generate your CSS from a set of variables that are easier to be maintained. I mean, this is basic stuff today in 2019, and yet most monolithic CMSs are more focused on staying alive than they are on actually creating very nice developer experiences. And so when you open up the ability to have these individual teams, you're able to then embrace a lot of the advances that we've had in the modern tooling process, where from Webpack builds to the huge advances, even just in the Java stack as well. It's just a much nicer experience. I've listed on the right-hand side just 4 of the most common mobile frameworks alone. These all will let you target between desktop, mobile, iOS, and Android. I mean, these are amazing experiences to work with. And if you are locked into the framework of a specific CMS, you just don't get to take the advantage of that. All right, moving on to the next section here. We're making some pretty good time. We're going to do the data deconstruction, so breaking down the bits of your project. This is where I get a little bit dogmatic in some of my views. And so if I step on anybody's toes, I apologize in advance, but this is where we're going. So this is the content architect gospel. If you're a developer, you are for sure familiar with Knuth's quote, "Premature optimization is the root of all evil." Well, I have my own version of that, and I say that mixing presentational logic with content is the root of all confusion. What I mean by that is that the biggest pitfall of headless architecture is modeling your content on the consumer. And I'm going to have an example here for us. A very, very common one that we see all the time, specifically with Graph CMS, is sort order. And it is something we are actually trying to enable, because there are cases where this is needed and there's no other way around it. But people will oftentimes have a situation where they maybe want to have a couple of like 3 or 4 relationships attached to a post, and they'll say, okay, I want to be able to give these a manual sort. So they say, okay, this is now I have to add an extra field on there called the order field, and then I give that a manual order. But that becomes super tedious, because if you come back in later and you have to remember, well, what was the index that I gave to the other item, and then you start doing something funny where you'll say, okay, this is an index of 50, and the other one is 100, and the other one is 1,000. And so then I know that I'm always able to be working with the proper ratios here. It becomes problematic, and the primary problem is that there's actually usually a reason behind the sort order. So I suggest here that a better approach is to figure out what is your sorting strategy. So do you want to sort by vacancy or seasonality? I have vacancy there twice, so it's an important thing to sort by, apparently. You find something that is important about what it is it's actually causing you to define this sort order. And the reason is that presentational logic is a derived heuristic. It is something that's basically an assumption. And your job here is to actually find that underlying assumption that's causing you to want to give that sort order any kind of priority, and say, okay, why do I put this item on top and that item on the bottom? Maybe it's this photo has people in it, or this photo has, or this hotel is the cheapest, or whatever those may be. When you figured out what your underlying data point is, it's actually causing you to make that sort order. Use that as a undeniable truth on the data, and then be able to sort on that on the client, not having to worry about the sort order on the model. Do the sorting on the client, which is super quick, and you'll be able to have much more powerful and flexible data. Another common mistake that we see often is with like text overlays. You understand the idea of sort of a header image, and you have maybe somebody climbing a mountain. On the left-hand side, we have text, or whatever it may be, is the standard kind of banner with text overlay. The temptation here again is to be able to create every possible permutation of this layout and say, okay, well, I have a text left option, I have a text right option, I have a text top option. On down the list it goes. And really quickly, this just clutters up your API. It becomes messy to work with, and then it can lead to conflicts later. I would suggest instead is to indicate where the focal point is on the asset. And this way, you can actually have your logic inside of the templating say, if focal point is right or focal point is left, then I can go ahead and put my text left or right depending upon that answer. And that becomes an inherent truth about the data. And that's just something that I think a lot of people really miss when they come over to Headless CMS, but especially those that maybe have experience in a WYSIWYG context. It's really important to try and keep your data as pure as possible, and allow the consuming context to make all of the assumptions or all of the presentational implications as it can. A concept that I tend to work with in working around some of the edge cases is then to use the idea of what I call content joins for the old school database people in our audience. The join is where you say this table needs to connect to that table, but the only really clean way to make that connection is through a third table that I'm able to then associate and say, okay, this guy belongs with this one over that other table, and it becomes its own model. And in this case, that's a perfectly valid option. You could have a editorial layout block model. And in that case, it's able to own an asset and it has its own text. And so I could say, all right, this editorial layout block uses this asset, which has a focus of right. And then this layout block has the text of hello, and it's allowed in the context of desktop and mobile. And that's a way to work around some of the restrictions of saying, okay, I want to apply all of this content on my asset or inside of a huge page model. The idea here is that you want to work with what I refer to as the headless first principles. Reduce a content model to the smallest reasonable shape, then build from there. And so once you break down the content into who actually owns which data into the smallest models possible, then you're able to really have a lot of power and flexibility with your content. It's really almost impossible to break a content model down too small. It takes a little bit of extra setup, and it's why content architecture is a really important role when it comes to ahead of the CMS context. But when you define your content model, it really is able to open up and give you a lot of that flexibility and power and say, okay, now I can really query any piece of this data in isolation of the other or in accompanying with the other and have a very powerful experience. So before I move on to the innovation slide, I'm going to just do another check-in and see if we have any questions. How are we doing, Alex?
Not any other than the one about the Algolia updater. If you wish, you can answer it now, or maybe in the end.
Sure. Let's address that one now quick. So the question was, how does the indexing work? Is it pushed from the front end application? It's not pushed from the front end application. It is pulled from the headless CMS itself. So the microservice in this case, this is a node script that you would run inside of a server, and that server perhaps every hour or triggered by a webhook or once a day, however you define the freshness of your data, will then pull the data out of the headless CMS and then push that data up into the Algolia index. It's not actually from the front end per se, it's from a microservice. When you talk about microservice architecture, it becomes a little bit of a figuring out who the front end is, like who the client is, becomes a little bit confusing because it could be that a microservice is the client of this data. But yeah, it looks like you've answered there. Yeah, so it is a separate node in the architecture. Yeah, that is correct. Does that answer the question?
Let's
so
see.
Yes.
All right.
Thanks for the question, G. All right.
Thank you, Jesse.
So, yeah. And we're doing really good on time here. So if I need to step back and repeat anything, please feel free to mention. We're going to do a live teardown on a page here in a few minutes. So perhaps then we'll go along there. All right. So let's talk about exploring innovation, breaking down the bits. What we have here is the what is it, a penny farthing, I think, a really, really old school bicycle. And then you have the Wright Flyer from the first airplane, quote unquote. The Wright brothers were bike mechanics, and they basically created the first airplane from their knowledge about bicycles and mechanics and all these pieces. And they broke down a whole bunch of bicycle hardware and made an airplane. It's highly oversimplifying, but the idea here is that if you deconstruct something into its really base pieces, it may be possible to reconstruct this in a new way. I've used the analogy in the past that if you broke down, a bicycle on the atomic level and you reconstructed the atoms into something new, you could have a Ducati at the end. I mean, you're essentially talking about the same molecules that you could reconstruct into an entirely new element if you break it down to small enough pieces. So, my mouse is starting to have some battery issues. All right. Okay, so the problem with innovation typically is that what you end up when you're trying to embrace an innovative product, and I've done a talk on this at API Days in Helsinki, and that talk will be also live soon. when you try to embrace, an innovative product, what happens, an innovative like product cycle in your company, what often happens is that because you have content living in a silo, you'll end up finding that the team that's in charge of embracing this new innovative idea starts to reproduce the content. They'll pull it out of the one system and bring it into a new one that's maybe a little easier to work with. And then because they now have this content living in a new system, they need to have, a new analytics, layer. And so then they'll start adding another role for this, another role for that, trying to be able to measure and manage and observe this innovative product. And you end up at the end of the day, you end up with two different silos. You have the core business, which has all of its data and infrastructure. And then you have the innovative product, which is running its own system. And you're missing somebody that has the oversight over both of them to be able to say, well, is the innovative product cycle actually working for us? Is this a cost center, or is this actually bringing in revenue? And it becomes a really difficult and complex issue until finally somebody says, that's it, no more innovation, because we need to focus on our core business. The solution that we find in the headless space is that when you're able to share data and infrastructure between the two tools or the two business models, you're able to then have that oversight. You're able to have the optics into the analytics and into the cost as well, because the core business is pulling from data, and it's pulling the data from the headless CMS, and it's sharing the same infrastructure and tooling, because the React modules and components or Angular framework that you're using for the core business can easily be shared over for whatever the innovative product is. And the innovative product is able to leverage on all of the existing tooling and all the existing data as well, and be able to ship quickly. And you have then the optics into the whole operation to say, okay, who's using which data? Is this thing actually working? And it allows you to work in a much more effective way. The optimal...
Sorry to interrupt. I think we have a question to just one of the last statements. I'm just going to allow one of the members, DNH Soft team, to share their question. Guys, you are allowed to talk now. Let's see if they have a question. If not, you can share it via the chat or the Q&A. We'll be definitely answering it in a few seconds or in a few minutes. Okay, then I'll just mute you again, and feel free.
Just collect the question and we'll answer it then at the end. Very good. All right.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, so then what you end up getting is the ideal product flow is that you have content, authorization, business logic, living in a SaaS or serverless or microservices environment. And that allows you to be able to operate down the pipeline of product innovation, from prototyping to marketing, microsites, landing pages, to your core mission critical apps and services, all the way down to integration and third-party vendors. You're able to power each of these individual steps with the same real-time data, the same real data that you're using in production. I know it was Facebook a little while back, they actually had, created a tool for their design software that actually would bring in real profile data to the layouts, because in isolation is where designers are able to think up really nice, very pretty profile photos, engaging vacation pictures, nice short names, all those kind of details that are really easy to design with. But in isolation away from the actual production data, when you get to the time to actually put the tires on the road, it could tend to fall apart because things didn't look quite as nice. Photos weren't always the same orientation, or whatever the details might have been were overlooked. When you're able to use the same content repo from the prototyping phase all the way down to the very last step, it becomes a much more powerful paradigm to work with. One of the tools that I'm a big fan of in the prototyping phase these days is Framer. It's a fantastic way to actually bring in real data and get a very realistic and native experience for demonstrating to a key stakeholder what it is that you're wanting to build before you really even have to touch the code. So what does this mean then? For existing websites, adding a headless, you can add a headless CMS slowly. You don't actually have to just replace the whole system right away. If you say, okay, we're sold, we want to go headless, you're able to start moving piece by piece of your existing website to a headless fed data. You can say, okay, we're going to replace this section of articles, or we're going to replace this gallery of photos with a headless CMS, and you can just start to take it apart piece by piece without having to do a massive rewrite of your whole system. It can be done slowly and carefully. You can migrate all that data over via API because it is itself an API. It's again an area where GraphCMS kind of specializes. We have a very open and powerful mutation API or write layer, and that allows you to bring in data in a very efficient and effective way, and then you're able to access that content again back into your system. And it allows you to embrace new technology. I mean, how many existing WordPress sites have not even have a zero trace of a React or Angular benefit on there? You can get a very nice and fluid experience even on an older site by simply starting to swap out some of these pieces with a little bit of newer technology instead of having to completely re-platform everything you've developed up till now. And then for innovation, you're able to use the existing data. You can actually embrace new technology right out of the box. You can use Flutter, you could use React Native, you could use Ionic or whatever you want to use and create very interesting experiences. And then you can also discover ideas from the data. One of the benefits about GraphQL, which is what we are based on, is that you actually get a self-documented API that you can simply open up a tool like GraphQL, which is an API Explorer, and see all the content you have permission to work with. It's just laid out there. And it becomes a very interesting way to start to query content and look at little slices of data and say, oh, what could I do with this? How could I break this apart? So again, really interesting and a very powerful paradigm to work with. I'm going to look at just a couple of quick examples of what I mean by this. So this first one is actually not a customer of ours. Wish it was. Under Armour, they have a very, very fragmented product landscape. I'm not sure if they're actually using a headless CMS or not, but this is not an uncommon model for a lot of businesses to end up with today. So you have their existing core platform, their web shop, and all the data. Then you have microsites, which are kind of cool and interesting experiences to engage, whatever the latest trend is, superheroes or whatever else it may be. Then you have the things they've actually acquired. So you have Map My Run, or you have MyFitnessPal. These are individual tools that now they have to integrate as well. And then you have their own initiatives. So they have their fitness bands and their iOS app and their digital weight scale. This is a very fragmented landscape. And if you were to have to try and support all of that with one monolithic CMS, that would not be a fun day. You would have to probably stand up several little micro CMSs or really be going anti-pattern in a lot of cases to support all these different features with any of the major monolith CMSs out there. And so this is a very common example for a lot of companies today, and it's a case that we would recommend is a perfect fit for a headless CMS. The next example is a customer of ours, so Discovery Channel. This is somebody who actually did exactly that with the small integrating a small portion. So this is simply one page on the Discovery website. If you're mostly from the US time zones, you'll know Discovery Channel is a massive platform. And with just taking one page, they're able to then integrate the headless CMS in a much smaller way. And so you can say, okay, we want to test this out. We want to try this, MVP idea we have, get building quickly and integrate that into an existing system. And then the last example I have here is the K+S is a large salt manufacturer in Germany. I think actually worldwide. They're huge, a massive company. If you look on the left there, that looks straight up and down the center for corporate design. It's a mining company essentially, and they decided to see what they could do with some of this agricultural data they've collected. And so they started looking at what they had, pieces of data, and they sliced it up into this urban farming application in Berlin. A totally different field, totally different aesthetic, a totally different vertical than they were in before, but leveraging the same data they have and repackaging it up, they were able to create a very interesting experience. So, and this is exactly the benefit or the vision for innovation, is using the existing data that people have. So with that being said, we can move on to a live teardown of an existing website and kind of see how I would perhaps deconstruct a website and where I would see as some potential risks, how I would reproduce a website's content in a headless context, and we will go from there. So I'm going to hop out of my full screen here, and we are going to use the great Under Armour here. If you can't tell, I'm an Under Armour fan. All right. So Alex, do we still have a screen here? You able to see my page?
We see it loud and clear.
All right. I heard that loud part. All right. All right. So let's take a look here, and we'll get kind of an assessment on what we have for content. We'll drive over the menu here. So we have standard product listings. Okay, basketball boots. That's all interesting. Let's pop open boots here. That looks interesting. Okay, I'll grab another one as well just to get a feel for it. Okay, interesting. Some accessories, but it's all products still. Over here, do we have some interesting stuff? Project Rock. We'll look at that. And let's see what we have for. Okay. Oh, we'll call it good for now. I'm going to open those in tabs, and we'll do some investigation. Actually, I'll pop out a full screen here because I lost work with tabs. So men's boots, what do we got here? We got classic products listing. Okay, simple, simple, simple. Black boots are in fashion, apparently. Let's take a look at some product details here. Okay, what do we got here? Oh, interesting. You got some 3D imagery that they're working with. So that's a case where a monolithic CMS may or may not actually be able to support these newer types. You've probably seen the cool VR apps where you could actually place those shoes like on the floor next to you and be able to see it. I don't know if Under Armour has that integration, but a lot of brands are doing that. IKEA, for example, you could place their furniture in your house to get a view for it in a VR viewer, AR viewer. Sorry. Product DNA. Okay, this is interesting looking to me because that looks kind of like something that I may see. I might be seeing that again the way they've written that. Product DNA sounds branded. Let's pop over to polos here. Let's take a look. Yeah. So product DNA. So I would, in this case, probably already start envisioning having a generic top-level product model that would include the product DNA field. And then that may itself own a polo model or a shoe model, but I would have that be a different model. So I would really start to break these apart. So this isn't just one product. This is now actually already two different products or two different entries. Interesting. Reviews and questions, that's interesting. So we don't support that just yet in Graph CMS. We are looking at it. You would want to incorporate this with some kind of a third-party tool that enables reviews. And in that case, this is again where using a microservice to stitch that API together, where you could say this product ID, fetch the reviews from whatever review system you're using, and bring it back together. Okay, it's interesting. Moving on, close that tab down. Let's look at the project page. Oh, this is nice. A little bit more styled, but actually not too special. This is actually still quite similar. This is just like a collections page. Yeah, so this isn't anything fancy in this case. This is just a collections page. Nothing to see there. Let's go back to the main page, see what else we got here to work with. So, customize. What's that? All right, what do we got here? So I'm smelling an application coming up here. So I'm customizable. Let's check it out. All right, so let's click on that and application big time. So this is a fantastic use case for a headless CMS where you're able to take the content and the data and you bring it over into an entirely new platform. Of course, it's under the same URL, but this is for sure a custom application where then you're able to come in here. It looks like you can, cool stuff, change colors on anything that you'd want to modify. This is fantastic. This is a really cool application, a cool experience for users, and one where you would want to definitely use a headless CMS to connect the data between the two of them. And I want to just kind of hop onto a pet peeve here real quick. This is like the future of shopping and of content. This is what we refer to as true user-generated content. Like this is like the future here, where anything that a user is doing on your page is user-generated content, whether it's information that you're obtaining passively, such as how many times they visited a certain page, or something they're actively creating. This is exactly what we're describing as what real user-generated content is. In marketing circles, they'll refer to user-generated content as like Instagram postings. Yeah, sure, that is user-generated content, but that's like a tiny, tiny portion of what user-generated content is. User-generated can be leveraged in so many ways. You could then see, okay, how many people are looking for certain colors, and then you could potentially have like know what your color trend should be for the coming month. There's a lot of data that you could pull out of a project like this. Let's pop back real quick to the main page if I can. Will it let me? Kind of. Oh, that's cool. Oh, another interesting product. This is why I love this brand so much. They always do really fresh stuff. Okay, this is a very specialized product. It's more content. There's not actually like an SKU. It's a product where you are signing up for a box delivery, and they'll send you product. That looks really awesome. Again, this is an idea where you would need to have a separate content model for this. You would potentially then need even another top-level product above the one that had the product DNA. So you would have the products, and then you would have maybe like core products, and then maybe something would be kind of like box products, and be able to start to nest these into each other in a really interesting pattern. And then if I were them from their business side, I would definitely try and leverage what the product DNA data that I have to perhaps use that as part of my profiling process in generating this custom box for individual users. Instagram, great. That's classic. This is the traditional user-generated content, not what we're referring to. I'm getting a little bit short on time here, so I'm just going to grab one more page here. I think I've been to the page there, so let's see if there's anything in the footer here. Newsroom, investor relations. Well, let's try investor relations. What do we got? Okay, yeah, microsite. So this is, again, an example. This is 80%, 90% sure this is not part of the same framework that they were using for their main site. Individual team will own this page, and you would have to then have a whole bunch of new pages and a whole bunch of new top-level entries to try and fit these in somehow next to your shopping pages. But in the case of a headless CMS, this is simply data that lives as, okay, investor toolkit, or what do we have under there? Yeah, so some files, some PDFs. And this can simply live as another model next to your content without having to be getting its own page model or whatever else it may be. Cool. Yeah, again, so let's see if there's anything here to just talk about real fast. This is, last point I'm going to cover, and then we'll go to a Q&A because I'm getting a little bit short on time here. So here's an example where you have a layout, and you would potentially want to have, if that's generated, and it's possible it's generated, you would want to have that sorting order logic. This is again where I would go ahead and say, all right, let's figure out what is actually the assumption behind the heuristic of the sort order. In this case, it may be always put wide photos on top, or it may be always put content models that are related to business on top, followed by career, followed by community. There's always going to be some sort of an assumption that you can attach that is an inherent value of the data that you'd be able to leverage for this kind of a sorting. And yeah, I'm going to leave this page open in case anybody actually has any questions to come back to this. If you have any, like, how do I replicate this in GraphCMS? I'll leave that open. But from there, I'm going to turn it over to Q&A then, because I think we are, we're there. Q&A.
Yeah, great on time. Thank you, Jesse. This was pretty interesting. I think we should have a monthly website teardown or application teardown session, just going around and, well, translating the old into the new approach. Thank you for this. So to everyone who's in the webinar, we'll be happy to hear your questions about anything that was shared by Jesse, or maybe topics that were not covered. So far, I have received some questions. One of them is, I believe it's more for our company, less about a headless CMS. It comes from Jovko Ambrev. And he asks if we have any plans to build a business partner ecosystem, and if so, can we share some details? For example, in which directions would you seek partners? Will you share a few thoughts on this, Jesse?
Yeah, so definitely we are looking at going the partner route. We believe that the implementers are going to be the greatest advocates for a headless CMS, because you are the ones that will actually get the vision and understand, like, the power behind this. So when you go into a company to recommend whatever the digital disruption strategy is you may want to be pitching to a company, we only need to make you believe, and then you're able to advocate that to the company and help them see all the benefit. So as far as the direction of who we're looking for, definitely focusing heavily on agencies on one level, but also even on independents, content architects or service architects, anybody who goes in and actually breaks down an older process into a new framework. So right now we have a fairly aggressive campaign to talk to agencies, because we believe that they really help close the full loop from oftentimes with the content architecture all the way through to the implementation of the final layouts. But anybody who would be wanting to work with it, we definitely are open to really any kind of partnership. And Alex, you can chime in there if you have an extra comment, because you're part of that team.
Yeah, well, basically, we can follow up after the conversation with some specific data, but currently our main focus is on technology agencies, web app and software development agencies. So there's a set of tools and support that is offered to anyone who would like to work with GraphCMS. We'll make sure to follow up on this after the conversation, after the webinar. Another question, it's, I believe, came directly to me. Do you see GraphQL as an important part of a headless CMS? What are specific use cases where GraphQL is important, is helping?
Yeah, so really specifically with, I'm going to see if I can scroll to the slide that it was relevant with. I'm not sure where it's at actually, but yeah, I won't waste time trying to locate it. The idea here, actually, this is an okay one to reference. With GraphQL, and for those that are not familiar with it, GraphQL is a query language that allows you to descriptively describe the data you want to get from a server. So traditionally, if you're sending a page of data, on the server with a REST response, you're basically sending everything, images and the whole 9 yards. That can be in the case of, say, like that Google Home or Google Hub, the audio device. That's just an excessive amount of data. Or to the watch, for example, it's just a really excessive amount of data. The watch may only need to know, are these hotels open? And not need to know anything else. And in that case, GraphQL is a great way for that to be able to specifically ask for just the data that it needs, keeping a very light payload on the server, on the wire. On the other side, when you come to some more intricate applications, and really interestingly, in the coming future with more interactive, let's say automobile apps and whatnot, you remove the amount of round trips on the server. And so with GraphQL, you're able to reference your data in relationships and in a graph type structure, so that where if I wanted to get posts in a REST system, I'd make one request, say, okay, I need the post IDs, make another request for each of those post IDs. I want to get the post title and content and author, and then for each of those author IDs, I want to get another author. So you get a lot of these round trips back and forth, and if you're going 160 kilometers an hour down the Autobahn, you may be dropping a lot of data in that process. But if you are going to be using GraphQL, if you've gotten one successful request out and the successful response back, you have all the data you need to deliver the experience. And this is also just great for mobiles as well, because moving around anytime that you're going to be not on a static or traditional system, it's really helpful. Yeah.
Thank you for this. We have another question.
Last thing about GraphQL, sorry. Also, GraphQL is really nice in a headless CMS because it allows your content to be very descriptively generating your schema. So it allows what you want to store to be exactly the API you have. And so there's no need to define custom endpoints around it. It's able to really generate for you. What your data model is what you get, and it's a great way to work. Sorry, go ahead.
All right, thank you. Another question: how do you generally? I guess this is more for. No, how do you generally handle localization and site text within a headless CMS? Do you split and spread text across the individual models and thereby lose transparency on the overall site text, or aggregate all site text within a single locales model?
Yeah, so I'm hoping I understand the question properly. Localization is one of those topics that you really need to be able to, where you need to be able to very specifically handle it in a defined way. So usually with GraphCMS, we try to be unopinionated and allow you to create the models you would want. With localization, it requires some extra thought. And so what we've done is we actually replicate the fields for each locale on the model. So if you are supporting 3 or 4 different locales and you enable those inside of the system, then all of your fields that are getting localized, which you also define on your data model, those will get a locale key on a duplicated field. So let's say titles. You'd get title EN, title DE, title CN, and so on and so forth, because we believe that data still belongs to the individual entry. It's not on a locales thing. It's still an individual entry.
Okay, thank you.
Does that answer the question, Opchope?
If it doesn't, please feel free to ask in the chat on the Q&A. Thank you. Let us see. Are there any other questions from the audience? If not, I will give Jesse the final word, or any final words from you. I want just to share 2 more final things for the day.
So last thing for me, and then I'll give it back to Alex to wrap it up. We have free developer accounts. We have really flexible pricing. Try it out. If you want to test out a headless CMS, if you want to look at the content and how to work with it, we are developers ourselves. And so we really want to make sure that it is the world's most developer-friendly CMS to work with. Please sign up and test it out. We are also very responsive to answer any of your questions on our support forums inside of our Slack community, on Intercom, where we are there, we are listening and like to answer. And this is, it's a great experience to see kind of where the puck is moving as far as content goes. And again, this is our first webinar, so please hit us up with feedback. But beyond that, thank you for your time and thanks for attending today.
Thank you very much, Jesse. Two final things from me. From our poll in the beginning, we had a very interesting result, 50-50. 50% of the audience actually are using Headless CMS in production. We hope that we have helped you do an even better work with these projects. The other 50%, we hope that we have tilted your mind towards switching to Headless or using it in some of your newer projects. And the final thing, after the conversation, we will, or after the webinar, we will send out the information about the conference, the GraphQL days taking place in southern Germany, the beautiful Bodensee in the beginning of September. We'll send out the information about the winners per email. Oh, we have one more question. What is the simplest way of consuming data from GraphCMS? Is it possible using it without Apollo or other similar middleware?
So the most simplest way, I'm a JavaScript developer, so I'll speak to that, is simply using the built-in fetch library. So you could just make a fetch request and using a post with the GraphQL statement that you want to query, and just using the built-in. I mean, you could make a request from the Chrome console if you wanted to, and it would be the most simple way. Anything that makes a post request is able to fetch data from our headless from GraphCMS.
Thank you, Jesse. Hope this helps, Michael. All right. Well then, everyone, thank you a lot for attending today. If you have any other questions, feel free to write to us per email, and let us know if it can be of any further support to you. Have a wonderful afternoon. Hope the heat is not too tough on you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.